Our first speaker is Michael Shilman, who is a product manager at Storybook. Michael will be talking about how Storybook helps align design and development, and what does it mean and why does it matter. So Michael, you can take it from here.
Thank you so much, Julia. Let me get my screen shared here. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
All right. That's okay. So I'm talking to you today from Borneo. In the middle of the night, it's 2 a.m. due to a monumental scheduling disaster. I'm in the middle of my vacation here, but I'm really excited to be a part of this webinar. And I'm going to talk to you about Storybook for product development. Since it's the middle of the night, if I spontaneously fall asleep in the middle of the presentation, I apologize in advance. So a little bit about me. As Julia mentioned, I'm a maintainer of Storybook and a product manager for Storybook. I also develop a product called Chromatic at a company called Chroma. This is my picture before Storybook with a full head of hair. Product managing a product that's an open source product with over 900 contributors from every continent around the world except for Antarctica is sort of like herding cats on steroids. And it's been a pretty grueling process. We've done about 700 releases in the past couple of years. And I've been responsible for all of those releases. And I want to talk about design and development today. Because I'm really lazy, I wanted to summarize my talk in 2 tweets. Since everybody here is interested in tooling, you all probably heard about the new Sketch Cloud tool that just came out in beta a couple of days ago, bringing developer handoff to the browser for free. And then this response, which I retweeted today from Devon Govett. Handoff is perhaps the worst, oh, sorry. Is perhaps the worst term in our industry at the moment. It implies that design and development are completely separate and that design can be done. Design and development are really a single collaborative process. Our tools need to unify to reflect that. So that's kind of a tweet that came up in my timeline today. And I felt like it was really sort of appropriate for this conference and really summarizes nicely what I'm about to say. But I want to elaborate on that. What does it mean for the tools to unify? And I'll talk about that through the lens of Storybook. Storybook, for those of you who are not familiar, is a workshop for building UI components faster. This is a picture of Storybook on the right-hand side of the screen. And I'll step you through that really quickly. I think probably a lot of people have used Storybook, are using it already, but just as a refresher. Storybook is a catalog of all the UI components in your application or design system and all their key states. And we call these states stories. So in this example, we have a histogram chart, and there's probably a normal state, a loading state, an error state, and so on. And so you can think about individual components like buttons, a section on a page, or even an entire page can be a component. So it's really just a collection of all of your UI elements in code. Each story is an isolated component state. That means that your component exists outside of your application, sort of like a clean room environment. This enforces modularity when you can render a component on its own. It sort of forces you to write those things in a certain way. It's a great way to explore hard to reach states. So for example, if you have something like a credit card expiration screen, something that would be really hard to get to in your app, but in Storybook, it's just another state, it's another story. Storybook is compatible with every major view layer, React, Vue, Angular, Ember, web components, HTML, Svelte, blah, 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 blah. It's kind of a framework where you learn it once and then you can reuse it as your stack evolves, since we all know that the technology landscape is changing very quickly in the front end. And it's really easy for frameworks to integrate. So whenever a new framework comes along, they integrate into Storybook. Furthermore, Storybook is supercharged by hundreds of add-ons. There's documentation add-ons for building out design systems. There's control add-ons for kind of tweaking around your components and exploring their different states interactively. It integrates with design tools, test tools, source code, accessibility testing, theming, and on and on and on. There's about probably over 100 add-ons for Storybook. And so there's a whole ecosystem, and that's basically what Storybook is. But more importantly is what it does. Storybook powers UI development across the entire industry. And it's pretty much the tool of choice for building out UI components today. This is a quote from Airbnb's Adam Neary. The tool we use for editing UI is Storybook. It's the perfect place to make sure your work aligns with designs to the pixel across breakpoints. And so Airbnb was one of the first users of Storybook. They have about 100 different storybooks in their front end, and it's fully integrated into their UI process. You guys are probably all familiar with Twitter's redesign over the summer. Twitter was built out in Storybook. Slack, which we use for the product tribes, was also built in Storybook. Here's a screenshot of Slack Kit, which was basically a Storybook for all the components that make up Slack. And if you're into design systems, IBM Carbon design system was built in Storybook. Shopify Polaris design system was built in Storybook, and on and on. Thousands of teams use Storybook to write millions of stories. So when I explained to you what Storybook was, which is kind of a pretty simple tool, and I explained to you who used it, probably the first question that comes to your mind is, why the heck is this thing so popular? I could probably write that in a weekend. And I have written that in a weekend before. It's popular because modern front-end teams are addicted to it. It's a quote from Andrew Frankel at Salesforce. Storybook is crucial to our UX process. The old way seems ludicrous now. So Storybook is more than about building individual components. It's also about a process for UX. What does that mean? It means that Storybook is a shared space for production components, and production is a key word there. These are the components that ship in your app. They're the components that are versioned and so on. And within Storybook, you can develop the components in isolation. You can document the components. Designers can inspect the components for fidelity and for flow. Testers can test the components in automation, and it's really fast to test. And each of those is probably a talk in itself. But what this enables from a product standpoint is it's about organization and alignment. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. Specifically alignment, how Storybook can help align design and development. All right, so I think if you've built out products before, you know that the initial design that you start out with is never what you end up shipping, and that the design evolves a lot during product development. And with any luck, the product becomes higher quality over the course of the product development, but that's not necessarily the case. And navigating the product and its design and its reification is really crucial to building products. Really have to get this right. So you can have the perfect design and a really, really mediocre implementation of that design. For a more realistic example, I read a quote from Steve Jobs recently where he was complaining about concept videos this was in the context of CES, which was recent conference, and there were so many concept videos, and people were bashing the concept of concept videos. And basically, the problem with concept videos is that they are completely unconstrained, and the real game happens when you start to encounter the constraints of actually building out a product. And so to do design really well, you actually need great product as well, so that navigation happens smoothly. So if you agree that navigating the product development process is really crucial, how can Storybook help with that process? And so going back to our kind of timeline here as the product evolves, I've kind of broken it down. I don't know that this is an exhaustive list, but this is a list of different sizes of forces in product development. So different things that can sort of jiggle your product up and down in quality in small, medium, large, and extra large forces. So small forces are things like margins, fonts, spacing. These are little details. And these are little details that make the difference between something that looks beautiful and polished and has that right touch versus something that looks ugly or unprofessional. And when you have a clean environment where you can see your entire product laid out and designers can scrutinize it and make sure that all those details get right, you avoid death by 1,000 cuts. And so that's kind of the simplest way that building out your components in Storybook can help sort of mitigate those small forces and make sure that it gets better over time and not worse. Medium forces are things like transitions and individual behaviors in your product, making sure that when you click and the data is loading, it loads smoothly and everything feels delightful and not clunky. And this is basically when you sweat the right details, it shows. And Storybook is an environment in which it's really designed to do that, because it's the sort of clean room environment where you can look at individual pieces of your app and sweat the details. In the large, I think this is where Storybook really shines. So you're building out all these states for all your components. And the thing about design is that design typically focuses on the happy path. And the reality is that there's 100 different unhappy paths that come into play when you're actually building out the product. And as those states and flows get discovered, they need to be incorporated into the product. And so when that's all documented out in a Storybook, and again, designers, product managers can scrutinize those things, you are able to basically have a blueprint for your app in a way that you have in design tools, but up until now you haven't really had in development tools. And so my conjecture here is that product development is actually design. There's a design that happens up front, and then there's a design that happens continually throughout the development process. And right now there aren't really great tools for that, and Storybook is an attempt to be such a tool. And then finally, in the extra large, you have conceptual changes to your product. And these can come from user feedback, from A/B testing, from all sorts of different sources, just insight as you yourself use the product. And Storybook doesn't do anything specifically to help with this. But the thing is that when you're building out a product, it's actually a very complex process. And as a product manager, you are really trying to sort of steer a cruise ship, especially for a large and mature product. And it's just much easier to steer the ship when this ship is in order. And so when you've built out all these components in Storybook, you've documented them, you've kind of built things modularly, it's actually much easier to test everything and to change everything. And so Storybook helps you go faster when you want to make conceptual changes. So that's kind of a conceptual look at how Storybook might help with a product development process. But how can you actually use it today? What does that mean in practice? So the first thing is around design handoff. So there's a collection of design tools ranging from Sketch, Figma, Zeppelin, Abstract, InVision, Adobe XD, and more. And you can basically import your designs from those tools into Storybook and build out your components in React, Vue, Angular, and so forth. What does that look like in practice? This is an example of an add-on from Abstract. And so Abstract imports from Sketch and XD. And on the top, you can see the Storybook component. And on the bottom, you can see the asset that's coming from Abstract. So this is kind of one instantiation of a handoff where a designer builds out a component in the design tool of their choice, and then they can see it side by side with the production implementation and check for it. And that can be used either to verify the implementation or also to spec out for a developer what the developer should build. There's also tools for visual review of your production code. So you can publish a Storybook and get feedback on it, iterate the UI, and every time you push changes to your code base, you can repeat that process. And this is a tool called Chromatic that I work on, which allows you to basically comment on storybooks in the cloud based on the states and based on the changes that happen in each commit. And together, these things enable sort of a design and developer workflow that tries to be a lot more integrated than what's been possible in the past, where you have design handoff on one side and visual review on the other side. Storybook is also a great tool for building out design systems that may contain design assets as well as production components. And these things combine into like a living documentation that sort of evolves with your product. So one example of that is Design System Manager from InVision, which integrates Storybook. So in this case, they have the Design System Manager, which is like a hosted service, and embedded inside Design System Manager is a Storybook to show your production components. A second example of this is Storybook Docs, which is a recent feature from Storybook, where you build out your stories and then automatically generate documentation for that. And we'll be building in a lot more features for integrating design assets as well. So to wrap everything up, I want to take a few things away from the talk today. The first is that Storybook is a trusted tool for building great products. The second is that it helps product managers and teams align design and development. The third is that it integrates with major design tools via add-ons that you can use today. And the fourth is that there will be a lot more collaboration features in the coming months. So thank you so much. My video seems to have gone off somehow. I'm not sure how to get it back, but has asked me to start my video. There I am. I'm back. So this is me. Is my Twitter handle, link to the Storybook website, and I'm Shilman on the Product Tribe Slack. So if you or your team are using Storybook and have any questions, feel free to ask me anything after the talk or at any time. I generally give support for Storybook. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Michael. So we have a few questions, and the first one is Storybook looks like a bridge between design and developers. Do you imagine that designers and developers would use one tool and one language in the near future?
That's a tricky question. I mean, I think there's a huge spectrum of designers, and there are designers who are already using tools like Storybook. Designers who don't even need tools like Storybook because they design in HTML and CSS on the fly. And there's designers that are extremely kind of conceptual and don't even get to the point of drawing mock-ups and barely use tools like Sketch as well. And everything in between. So I think that there will always be a lot of room for different tools in this space. And Storybook's kind of position in it is whatever happens, we want to be kind of the source of truth on the development side. And we want to provide a bunch of features to help teammates collaborate within Storybook. And we also want to integrate with every tool out there to help get those production components into whatever form they need to be in. So I don't think we're trying to be a one-size-fits-all solution. We'd like to do as much as we can in Storybook, and we'd also like to integrate. And also one other thing that I wanted to mention to anybody who's watching is that we're building out kind of a partner program for Storybook. And so if anybody is building other tools in the space and is interested in integrating with Storybook, please contact me as well.
Thank you, Michael. And question number 2, from your perspective as a seasoned product manager experienced in collaboration with developers, what is the one thing that is worth to remember when a designer works with developers?
What is the one thing that is worth remembering when a designer works with developers? God, that's a tough question. And it's especially tough for me since I'm also a developer. So I have a very biased perspective on all of this, given that I have a technical background. But I think probably the one thing that I would take away from various experience working kind of at every level of the stack is just that, like, everybody who's attacking a problem is typically pretty smart in their own ways. And so even when people are speaking kind of different languages, really trying to understand where kind of the way it's easy to get mad at somebody because you're not speaking the same language, or because, you know, they don't understand how hard it is to build something, or you don't understand how much they've thought about the different scenarios or whatever. But I think really kind of like being optimistic about the person you're collaborating with and trying to understand all of the insight that they bring to the problem. If everybody kind of comes at it with that attitude, it makes things a lot easier.
All right, thank you. And question number 3. How does your team of designers and developers write documentation for style guides, etc., if there's any?
We don't. We built out a tool called Storybook Docs. Storybook Docs was released in September the first iteration. The second iteration was released a couple weeks ago. And we are in the process of building out our design systems in Storybook Docs. We have one built that's used on 3 or 4 different sites. And we are currently in the process of documenting Storybook Docs itself in those documents. And for Chromatic on the commercial side, we have a very exhaustive storybook for that with no documentation or little documentation. So one of the main insights about Storybook is that simply enumerating the states of your components gets you really far. And so it's obviously not as satisfying to just have those states as to have like pros and do's and don'ts and various other things that you might want to read about with respect to a component. But especially if you're building an early stage product and kind of churning things pretty quickly, you can get a lot of mileage from just having the states. So if you look at Storybook's design system, it actually doesn't have, it's built out as a documentation site, but it's pretty thin on the text.
All right, and we have another question coming in. So how do you get buy-in for building a design system in your small organization?
Well, I mean, in our case, we're sort of in the business of building kind of design tools and design systems tools. So it's not hard, but I think in general, my sort of approach, and I don't have a lot of experience with sort of evangelizing design systems, but I think building something quickly in Storybook or whatever tool you use, and trying to show the value kind of out of the gate, rather than sort of a top-down approach, but just kind of a bottom-up, get something together, show that it saves time, show that it makes people's lives better, is probably the route that I would always take for just about any sort of evangelism.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah, it was great. Oh, one moment. We have one more question. I'm sorry. Okay, so the question is, what are you looking forward to for the future of Storybook? Anything you can share regarding where the product is headed?
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's a whole other talk. I
It
hope
is.
we have more time. Yeah, I think the biggest thing that as we've been building Storybook, it's also been kind of a bottom-up process. It's a chaotic process. We have 900 contributors, and sort of it's growing like crazy every day. But a lot of it's been just really kind of filling in the basics, supporting all these different frameworks, supporting these different add-ons, making the add-ons support all the frameworks, and so on. But I think the place that we are sort of going towards now is 2 things really excite me. The first is building out a real add-on ecosystem. So we have partners who are very interested in integrating with Storybook in different ways. For example, automated compliance and accessibility services can benefit from this. And so like we have an accessibility add-on, but like we're not going to build out a full solution in Storybook. The first round of kind of integrations we did was for testing, for automated testing. And there's at least 3 or 4, commercial tools running on top of Storybook. It's built its own little like industry. And so now design tools are starting to integrate and so forth. So I'm really interested in integrating with product management tools for planning this stuff and for kind of monitoring the progress as things complete. And I think building out the ecosystem is really kind of the main thing for this year. And we just haven't had the kind of time or space to even think about that up until now. And so that's one area that I think is really interesting to me. And the second area is around hosted solutions. So if you kind of if you think about Storybook in the sort of lens of a desktop app like Sketch, like Storybook is not quite analogous to Sketch, but it's something that developers install in their products. They run it on their machines. They maybe run it on their CI servers, but there's not kind of like a hosted shared environment where everybody can come and comment on stuff and so forth. And so we'll be releasing our first iteration of that, I think at the end of Q1. We're in early access right now. So if you have a team who's interested in participating, please feel free to reach out to me as well. But basically, like, that opens up a whole new channel for collaboration that wasn't there before, because it's totally reasonable to expect a developer to install some JavaScript package on their machine and get it running. And it's pretty much not reasonable to expect the same of a designer or a PM. And so I think that that'll kind of unlock a whole bunch of new flows that people have already been kind of cobbling together themselves using Netlify or some other service, maybe something they built in-house, but actually kind of supporting it first class in Storybook will be really exciting. So those are probably the two areas that excite me the most.
All right.
And are both coming very soon in the next few months.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. So it seems like you really got the audience interested, because we've got yet another question. Do you have a favorite design process or methodology you prefer using or have found to be the most effective, like design thinking or the increasingly popular design sprints?
No. I've been really fortunate to work with some fantastically talented designers where I think it's been fairly ad hoc, and things have kind of come together in great ways, in spite of a lack of process. And so I have lots of opinions on the development side of things, but not so much opinions on the design side. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for this great presentation. We really enjoyed it, Michael. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.